William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. Welcome to the College of Complexes, being held at Barbec's Restaurant at 8949 Garland Road, Dallas, Texas. Gently embracing the east side of White Rock Lake. When I entered, I was greeted like coming home to Grandma's house, warm and friendly. When visiting the Barbec's Restaurant, tell them you want your reservations for the next College of Complex class.
Well, good evening, everyone. We're so glad you were able to make it out this evening. Haven't we had a nice week this week? Has everybody thought they might have been up in upstate Michigan or instead of Dallas this week? Good night. We don't get middle of July like this very often, so thanks for the moisture and thanks for the cool air, and it's been very pleasant. I'm glad all of you were able to make it out this evening. There's several of you who are here for the first time, so I'll walk through a little bit of our basic foundational stuff tonight that I'm more inclined to skip because we've done it so many times over a period of about 5 years we've been going. But College of Complexes was started up back in the early 50s in Chicago, downtown in a bar, and I think it had a name like that they adopted, and it's moved a time or two, but it's been going non-stop for a little over 60 years. And it operates in the inner city. I don't think it's down inside the loop, but it's in what you and I would look at and call downtown Chicago. And they generally will have about 60 or 70 people come to the meeting. And a lot of them are just very ordinary folks like we are. There are a few kooks that come regularly, so they kind of make it interesting. Kooks, crazies, wackos, strangos.
Jim, were you looking at me?
George, keep it in line tonight. But Tom and Susan Berry actively participated in that for a number of years, and they moved down here in the spring, maybe 5 years ago, and Tom and I got acquainted up at the Castle Inn, the Starbucks, and chatted and visited a lot and ate some meals together, and he told me about the group, and he said, I'd like to try to start that up here in Dallas. So he did, and I agreed to help him. And I don't get up behind the podium and run the meetings or MC the meetings unless he's gone and out of town. But I'm always happy to do that when he's gone. I'll make sure the sound system is up and running, and I'll help with whatever needs to be done. He and Susan have adapted pretty well to the hot Texas summer, but somehow they managed to squeak off in July or August and go up to Chicago for a month. This time some friends who'd moved over to Ann Arbor, Michigan, or a little town just next to it outside Detroit, asked them to come house sit for a month while they went to Iceland. I mean, that sounds like some pretty good duty for this time of the year, doesn't it? Off to Iceland. So I'm sure those people are enjoying some nice weather. But Tom and Susan are up there in their house. They have 2 cars to drive, and I think they'll make a side trip to Canada, and we wish them well. I spoke with him on the phone this morning. George talked with him on the phone earlier today, and they seem to be doing well and enjoying it. This is basically how our meeting operates. We start up, we run from now until about 8:45 when we shut it down. The restaurant closes at 9, so we try to shut down, get all the stuff put back together, the equipment, and get it out of here and let them close it down and go home so they can open up at the crack of dawn on Sunday morning. And so if you want to talk, there are 2 good options. One, there are usually a group of us who will retire to the Starbucks in Casa Linda, just a few blocks down the street. If you're not familiar with it, probably about 6 or 7 blocks on your right, just as you come up to the Casa Linda Shopping Center, and there's a traffic signal ahead of you, which is Buckner Boulevard. There's a not occupied convenience store service station right on the corner on your right. This side of it, when you look at the shopping center, you'll see that there's a whatchamacallit, sandwich shop. Which one, Ray? Subway, yeah, my brain was off. Subway, and then the Starbucks occupies that little corner space. So they usually have enough seats that we can get in there and bring a group of us in and blab and talk. Sometimes we might carry on the subject of the evening. Other times we go off on some different tangents. So it's always a interesting post-meeting time. We enjoy it, and we enjoy everyone being here. We'll turn it over to Lloyd Chappell, our speaker tonight, who's spoken to us 3 or 4 times in the past. He's involved in a lot of investment advisory things in his day-to-day work. He's working on an advanced degree. He's shaking his head like, I don't do that kind of crap anymore. I'm just playing and going to school and doing as I please. Okay. Well, the last time I talked to Lloyd, he was still being a person who was working in that area. So excuse me, Lloyd, I didn't get an update from you. But he does have financial background. I'm just really telling you that to say he understands numbers and figures and understands the economy and how that works. Our subject tonight will be more political, social, I suppose, going back into the Roman Empire. But he'll talk to us for, something up to 60 minutes, depending on what his appetite is. And then we'll leave him here at the podium, and I'll fire up the cordless mic and take it around, and everybody will have an opportunity to ask him a question. Don't make a statement, don't get up on the soapbox and preach us a sermon. Ask Lloyd a question, he'll try to answer it for you if he knows. We'll do that for a little while. We kind of play that by ear, time-wise. And we'll leave some time set aside at the end, and we have a comment time when those of you who want to do it will have an opportunity to come up here for 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes and offer something that's might supplement what our speaker has said. It might disagree with a political point the speaker's made. It might be just anything, but don't get up and start a fresh subject for the night. Otherwise, we'll have a brand new set of discussions starting up. If you want to do that, save it for the coffee shop afterward, and we can bring it up and talk about it and explore each other's thoughts about it. But feel free to offer your comments about what you've heard Lloyd present to us. And, the subject that Lloyd is talking about, it has to do with lessons that we might learn from the fall of the Roman Empire. Well, good gracious, I don't think we want to fall. So anytime someone can talk to us about how another large, long-lasting government managed to fall into the dirt and not exist anymore, it's sort of relevant to us as a country because we like our country. It's not perfect, but we'd like to maintain it and keep it going. So anytime we can pick up some ideas and knowledge, it will be helpful to us as people who are voters and sometimes active participants in political committees and things like that. This is a wonderful venue, and Lloyd will bring us some perspective tonight that should add to that. Next week, we have Gene Lantz coming and speaking to us. Gene has a PhD, worked at the big Chancellot LTV aircraft manufacturing factory for years, got very involved in union activities as an officer, and he's been involved in political committees, and he's going to come and talk to us about some program that they're working on, and I'm sorry I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but yes, he'll explain that. We've probably all heard it referred to. I've been to at least 2 meetings when it's been discussed, and I'm not really equipped to get up and give a dissertation on it just from the amount that I've learned. It helps me understand, and I'm looking forward to him being here because he has dug into it, and I'm sure he'll provide some good information for us. So without any further stuff from me, I'll just ask you real quickly, does anybody have an announcement they need to make before we start Lloyd off on his presentation? Susie's not here tonight. She usually has one, so. And Mike didn't come with orders from headquarters to deliver a Susie message? Okay, very good. Well, Lloyd, thank you again so much for coming and joining us this evening, and the party's all yours for a while. Welcome.
Thank you. Can we kill the lights? Well, there will only be the minimal amount of political discussion in this presentation. This is a historical presentation. Now, there's a couple of jabs or stabs politically that I cannot resist, but that's just for humor. The last time I spoke at the College of Complexes, which was Lessons from the Fall of the Roman Republic, I did the incredible thing that had never happened before in the College of Complexes. Nobody got up and argued with me. And that just doesn't happen around here very often. And I'm betting that that will happen again tonight, because most folks here don't read Roman history. But if I step on your foot, by all means, let's have a rousing discussion. I have the daunting task of covering over 500 years in about 50 minutes. And this has a huge cast of characters. We have generals, emperors, senators, barbarians, barbarian generals, Persian kings, Persian generals, and lots of folks. There's an incredible list of colorful barbarians. We have Fritigin, Maroboduus, Stilicho, Gundobad, Alaric, and Ricimer. The great paradox of the fall of the Roman Empire is that when it fell, it didn't fall because the people inside or outside stopped believing it or stopped wanting it to happen. If we look at the European Union, they pale in comparison to the power and the size of the Roman Empire. No one in human history has ever run such a show for so long and wielded such power. I will talk about a number of things familiar and unfamiliar. The Romans suffered with crushing inflation. They suffered from wage and price controls that didn't work, just like it didn't work for Richard Nixon. They suffered from monetary debasement, like we're suffering from now. But then I'll talk about a number of things that are totally unfamiliar. We don't live in a country with absolute monarchs. We don't have state-sponsored religion. And we don't have taxing authorities that will literally break your legs if you don't come up with what they say you owe. You will see from this speech, we are not the new Rome. I used to attend many cocktail parties. People know that when I was financial advisor, I was also a Roman historian, and I always get nudged by somebody who says, Lloyd, you know, we're the new Rome. And my response is, no, we're not. Whenever an American president does something really dumb, or loses power, or loses an election, our generals do not get the National Guard and march on Washington. That's a very Roman thing to do. And if there's anything that we resemble much more the Roman Republic, the oligarchic republic, but that's only in the vaguest, loosest of sense. Tonight I will examine a number of the reasons that Rome fell, and I will debunk quite a number of them. Plus I will tell the story, which is an incredible story, and to do it justice, I need a very long time, which no one will give me, so I gotta cut it down to 50 minutes. We'll look at such things that Rome didn't fall from. Rome didn't fall from depravity and moral decadence. When Rome collapsed, it was run by Christians, and the barbarians were Christians. People forget that. It did not fall from its massive greatness, and it did not fall from massive corruption. There was a book written on that. Can you all read this? Can you see this? Okay, well, I have a quote here from Edward Gibbons, who wrote the very famous book in 1776 called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was a great work of scholasticism, but is very flawed in its conclusions. And he says, the story of the ruin is simple and obvious. And instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it subsisted so long. In 31 BC, the Roman Republic is officially dead. If we look at a period of 66 years, the Roman people, and Italy in general, have had 4 civil wars. They suffered from the Spartacus slave revolt, which was probably the greatest crime wave Italy has ever seen and hopefully never sees again. And they had a war with their own Italian allies. We are now, the 4th Civil War has finished. A fellow that we call Octavian, whose real name is Octavianus, has finally defeated Mark Antony and the ignominious Cleopatra. He is the last man standing. And before his great uncle Julius Caesar died, he adopted Octavian, who changed his name to Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Well, this guy turns out to be, perhaps he is the greatest of all the Romans. I consider him the greatest European politician and the greatest statesman Europe has ever produced. This guy was ruthless, but by gosh, he understood politics and he understood ruling. One of the amazing things is he was so brilliant. He was one of those rare human beings. He actually learned from Julius Caesar's mistakes. Because as you recall, Julius Caesar got the early retirement package. He got the knife. He got about 25 of it. And Octavian is now, for all practical purposes, a king. He's a king ruling a republic that hates the word king. So what he does the most incredible branding that a politician has ever done. He calls the Roman Senate and he says, look, fellas, since 44 BC, I have avenged my great uncle Julius Caesar. I've run Rome. I've ruined myself. I've wrecked myself. I've worked so hard. I'm exhausted. I'm going to give you all the power. And he controlled all the Roman armies. He controlled 300,000 men. I'm going to give it all back to you. I'm going to give you all my power. I'm done. But they realize that if he's done, there's going to be Civil War number 5, because a number of his relatives just happen to have high military commands, and they'd like to be the first man in Rome. So they actually wind up giving him all of his power back. Incredible theater. And they give him more power. So he rebrands himself. Instead of being called Octavianus, he's now called Augustus, which means revered one, worthy of honor. And all the records of his dealings, because a lot of blood was spilled for him to become the king who's not called the king. All the records of that, tremendous amount, were burned. But not enough, because we still know what he did. And this guy was so brilliant, he had to walk a very fine line. He's a king in all but name, but he can't act like a king. He doesn't have a palace. He lives, now he's got a pretty nice spread in Rome on the Palatine Hill, where the super rich live, but he doesn't lord around his power. And the Romans were very grateful to him because he kept them out of Civil War number 5, and he didn't act like a classical tyrant. He didn't have people executed. He didn't confiscate property. He had himself called princeps, from which our word prince comes from. And this literally means first among equals, or in the Senate, he would be the person everybody would talk to at first, but he's also the guy who controls all the armies. Augustus puts together an incredible system that lasts the better part of 200 years. always with Roman emperors, their power did not rest upon the love of the people, it rested upon the army. And the control or lack of control of the army led to just how long a Roman emperor would live. Now, the next emperor who came along, who was a really bizarre character named, we call him Tiberius here in Texas, but his name is Debasing. He described the emperor's handling of the army as holding a wolf by the ear. And about 100 years later, the greatest, to me, the greatest of the Roman historians, the guy we call Tacitus, he wrote an interesting treatise called Dialogue of the Orators. And in that he says, essentially, if you want peace, you got to put up with a military dictator. Here we see, oh, looks awful. Here we see, essentially, the Mediterranean as controlled by Rome. And we have to look at Augustus' accomplishment. The Mediterranean world from the Roman Empire had 200 years of peace that it had never experienced before and has never experienced since. Plus, the level of prosperity in the Roman Empire was not matched in world history until the 20th century. That once the last civil war ended, people realized all over the Mediterranean, in Palestine, and Egypt, Libya, France, Spain, there's no wars. The Romans, with their oppressive autocracy, stopped all of the infighting, all the border raids, they stopped it all. So sometimes autocracies are good. One of the interesting things is that the Romans gave up a tremendous amount of civil liberty. But after 4 civil wars, with an incredible number of people massacred in Italy, peace, security, plenty of food, that was all they wanted. Now the provincials, they never had any civil rights, and they lost them, they didn't care, but the Roman Empire ran the provinces terribly. And finally, when Rome became an empire, the entire government was actually run as a business, and an effective business. But there was one huge flaw in Augustus's leadership. He was a magistrate, he was a military dictator masquerading as a magistrate. He was not called king, he was called imperator, which means like supreme military commander. But he was a king. And he did everything to disguise that he was completely running the show. And he claimed that he was restoring the Republican institutions. No, he wasn't. He restored about 20% of them, and he kept the other 80. But the problem with his system is that when you have a bad emperor, and eventually you're going to have them, and the Romans had a handful of really horrible ones, there was no way to get rid of an emperor but to kill him. And a guy surrounded by 1,000 soldiers is real hard to kill. Things worked pretty good until Augustus's bloodline ran out. And it ran out with the guy you probably heard as Nero, who is perhaps the most despicable of all the Roman emperors. When that ran out, Rome went through 4 different emperors through civil wars in 1 year. And finally they wound up with a good guy. And it was only when a dynasty was completely finished that you would see Roman legion fight Roman legion. In good times, the Roman legions were very well behaved. Well, as we're coming to the end of this 200 years of peace, and there's 100 great stories we don't have time for, we come to perhaps the only Roman emperor who was not a ruthless SOB. Because in this game, and it's the same for the Chinese, the Persian emperors, the Byzantines, if you're not ruthless, you can't play this game. There's too many people want your power and will do anything to get it. But there was one guy who was actually a philosopher and maintained his integrity, Marcus Aurelius. But now things are changing. Rome was top dog for a long time, but the barbarians are on the move and they're breeding like crazy. The last 14 years of Marcus Aurelius's emperorship He has to be with the army on the Danube frontier. In times of crisis, the emperor must be with the army. 14 continuous years, they fought the Marcomanni, the Chatti, the Lombards, the Sarmatians. Well, finally, Marcus Aurelius dies, and he has a son who's an absolute total disaster. If you see the movie Gladiator, it's based on him, Commodus. Whose name actually means like real nice feeling and friendliness, but he was a psychotic idiot. And now we come to the next round of civil wars, 193 to 194, and the winner is a guy from North Africa of Carthaginian descent. Now, he looks European, but he's actually Carthaginian, and his name is Septimius Severus. He's an outstanding general. Incredible administrator, ran Rome well, and was as ruthless as he can be. Now, in the good old days of this 200 years of what's called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which is coming to an end, the emperors were accessible. You could see them on the street, and they wouldn't have lots of guards around. People could actually approach the emperor. Those days come to an end. Now, what we had is a very kind and friendly military autocracy. Now, we have an in-your-face military autocracy. Septimius Severus is a guy that power is the only thing. We read from the Greek historian Cassius Dio, who was actually a Roman senator, on Septimius Severus' deathbed. He is reputed to have told his two sons, who wound up killing each other, love each other, pay the soldiers well, and despise the rest. And the rest means the Roman Senate. So the partnership between the emperors and the Senate is pretty much gone. We're coming to the 200s, AD 200s. Things are changing. Rome has a new enemy now. Now, there was a people from Iran called the Parthians, who were an Iranian people but not Persian. And Rome had fought with them for almost 250 years and whipped them considerably. Whipped them so bad that they collapsed. And then a new people from Iran, the Persians, came along. And they were far more energetic. They had an agenda. They wanted a big chunk of Rome. And they wanted power from Rome. Their second king was a fellow named Shapur, who was the best military commander the Romans had faced since Hannibal. And this guy actually smashed 3 Roman armies, completely smashed them and chased them out of Iraq. So the Romans have to deal with this, and they have to deal with massive barbarian invasions that they've never dealt with before. It takes the Romans almost 50 years to get the government infrastructure to raise the taxes to deal with these incredible threats. Now, the Persians and the Parthians bring in an entirely new type of warfare that the Romans are a little bit slow, but they do catch on later how to deal with. Rome had conquered the entire Mediterranean with heavy infantry. As you think of the Roman legionnaire with his big shield and the armor that he wore, this type of warfare is pretty much coming to an end. The Persians and the Parthians are way ahead. They have mounted horse archers who are trained for about 15 years from age 6, and they have actual heavily armored knights. Not exactly like the knights in shining armor, but almost there. Eventually, the Romans completely copied them. Also, we see big changes in the barbarian world. Oh, this would be so much better if you could read this. In the 1st century AD, when the empire starts, if we look at what's Germany, there's lots of little bitty Germanic tribes, and they don't amount to anything. They're so poor, the Romans will not even bother to conquer them. It's not worth it. They don't have anything, you can't make money from them, so why conquer them? But here we are 250 years later, and in a famous work by Tacitus called Germania, he lists about 40 tribes, and he talks about them, and He moralizes that because they don't have the evils of civilization, they're still like sort of honest, even though they're smelly barbarians. But many of these tribes, the Cherusci, the Chatti, they're no longer mentioned in Roman history. But now there's these huge supergroups. They're multi-ethnic groups of different tribes that speak perhaps a similar language. There's the Franks, the Alemanni, the Saxons, the Burgundians. By the 4th century AD, Rome's Danube frontier, which is huge, is dominated by Goths and other Germanic peoples, because the barbarians have been fighting the Romans for a long time. They see the Roman life, they like it, and they want a piece of the action. Now, people ask me, well, why was there so many more barbarians 300 years later than there was, say, like in Julius Caesar's time? And once I flippantly said, well, it was a whole lot of sexual activity. But there happens to have been, we know from archaeology, a tremendous amount. They had an agricultural revolution. They finally got good at it. And with more food, more people. Yes, sir?
Can you define barbarian, please?
Barbarian would be all of the people living outside of the Roman Empire that are not literate. And that would be from north of the Danube and west of the Rhine. That's how they saw it. Now here I have a map of the Danube. And you can see the Danube, with Germany here, Austria here, Hungary, Romania, finally Bulgaria. Barbarians could come storming through anywhere. This is like an 800-mile river. Then we have the Rhine. They can come through anywhere, and they did. Finally, in the 3rd century, AD, 3rd century, Rome gets into serious crisis. And it gets so bad that for a time, it looks like Rome is finished. To give you an idea just how bad things got, in the first 266 years of the empire, Rome had 21 legitimate emperors confirmed by the Senate and 15 claimants, or usurpers. That's in 266 years. But in a 35-year period, they had the exact same number of 21 legitimate emperors and 38 usurpers. The problem was that army loyalties collapsed, which was a complete disaster for Rome. There's the question, well, why did army loyalties fail? Because they didn't fail during the Republic. Well, the classical writers, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Herodian, they do a lot of silly moralizing. They say, the army is all these low-class venal self-seekers and discipline relaxed, it's just a bunch of bombs. But in stable time, the Roman legions toed the line, but if an emperor looked like he was on the way out, they would feather their nest, and they would take their favorite general, and they would put him up to be first man in Rome. And for that, they were willing to fight. In the 3rd century, the Romans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. Now, also in these incredible defeats, there's quite a number of victories, but there's more defeats than there has ever been. The Persians invade the Roman Empire. They actually sack the town of Antioch. Now, the Persians never wind up conquering anything, but they were real big on loot and plunder. The Goths, who the Romans had not really dealt with before, they get seaborne, they get on 1,000 ships, and they loot, pillage, and plunder Greece and Italy. And that was the richest part of the empire. But those towns, cities after 200 years of peace, they weren't walled. And they were easy picking for the Goths. Barbarians burst into France, Spain, and even Italy itself for the first time in hundreds of years. The plague shows up repeatedly. The emperors are so desperate for money, they have got to increase the army. So they don't have bonds, they don't have paper money, they have coins, and they debase the coinage, which is very negative on the economy, which we're about to find out with all of our money printing. Well, case in point, when we're coming here to the bad times, the last emperor from the good times was a fellow named Severus Alexander. And he does the unthinkable thing. He tries to buy off this large Gothic coalition, Germanic coalition called the Alemanni. The soldiers find out about it. They murder him. So a successful general, a non-Italian named Maximinus Thrax. That means he's from Thrace. Now to the snobby Roman blue bloods, a Thracian is just hardly better than a barbarian. But this guy realized, okay, the last guy tried to buy the barbarians off, I better conduct a vigorous campaign. And he does. But he never even bothers to contact the Senate. He doesn't even go to Rome because he has a serious barbarian invasion on his hands. And he needs money, and he raises heavy taxes. Well, he raises taxes so much that all over the empire he becomes massively unpopular. In North Africa, which was actually the breadbasket of the Roman Empire and produced hordes of wonderful taxes for the Romans to spend, they pick their own guy. They get this guy in his 80s named Gordian. And all of the Senate in Rome, they want Gordian too. They don't want Maximinus Thrax. Once Maximinus Thrax soldiers realize he's on the way out, they murder him. And this is what we see for 50 years. His only reason to be emperor was he was a successful general. And as I mentioned, he wasn't even Italian. But they'd had non-Italian emperors before. His authority rested entirely on the military, and it was never secure. He spent all of his time dealing with barbarian invasion. And once it looks like his authority has lapsed, his own guys turn on him, and they're going to nominate their own guy. Because when you get a new emperor, the new emperor gives something called a donative, which is like a huge bonus to all the soldiers. The Romans have more barbarians than they've ever dealt with. Now, when they had reasonable amount of barbarians, they could deal with them no problem. But now they've got tons of barbarians. When you have a military dictator, the emperors essentially robbed the cities, and there was several hundred large cities in the Roman Empire. They took all their endowments, their tolls, their taxes, they just took it because they said, we need it more than you, and in a military dictatorship, nobody complains. Taxes had to come up. Now, this is an actual picture, awful as it looks, of a Roman silver denarius. This is probably worth about 40,000 bucks. Would I like to find some of those? This comes from the time of Trajan. This is probably 100 AD. Well, in Trajan's day, this thing was 90% silver. We come up to like AD 170, Marcus Aurelius. The denarius has gone from 90% to 75%. Then we come to Septimius Severus, let's say AD 200. The denarius is now only 50% silver. Then we come to Gordian III. The first two Gordians are massacred. It's fallen to 40%. Then we get to the guy who was seriously turned the problems around, Aurelian. The silver denarius is like 3 to 4% silver. Things get so bad, the Roman government will not take Roman money for taxes. They want commodities. They want food, they want wood, they want metal. They don't want Roman money. Well, okay, here's my only political stab. We have barbarians in the gate now. Now, this is actually a graph that shows you the value of $1 in 1913 when the Federal Reserve Bank took over, and now it's worth about 3 cents. So that's the only parallel I'll make between ancient Rome and us. I couldn't pass that up. Well, you can imagine, with all these barbarians coming in, and the barbarians are there not to sightsee. They're there to pillage, plunder, take whatever they can. This is bad for trade. Pirates show back up. This is bad for trade. The Romans wind up the last 200 years, about every 20 years, having a major civil war. The problem with Romans fighting Romans is the winter, there's no cities to pillage. Now, pillaging was, in the ancient world, let's just call it their IRAs, 401ks. That's how you got retirement money. You stole it from somebody else. And many, many times, Roman towns were pillaged by the succeeding, the folks who won the Civil War. Well, here's a little Roman corruption humor. A barbarian aristocrat, high in the barbarian government, comes to gets to know a Roman senator, invites him to come over across the Danube, and the barbarian shows him his wonderful estates and all of his slaves, and Roman says, yeah, this is pretty cool. He's not too impressed, but yeah, this is cool. He says, but I thought you'd do better than this. And the barbarian says, look out the window. You see that river out? You see the bridge on the river? The guy says, yeah. He says, whatever comes under it or over it, I get 10%. Roman goes, oh, okay. So a few years later, the barbarian aristocrat comes to visit the senator. And the senator takes him to see his palatial estates in the country and his lands. And the barbarian's impressed. And then the barbarian aristocrat looks to the senator and he says, you know, how do you do that? I got nice spread, but this is better. And the Roman says, look out the window. See the river out there? And the barbarian says, yeah, but there's no bridge. He says, yeah, but I get 100%. Well, that's Roman corruption. That's a joke, folks. Government changes. Well, you know, the purpose of government is to rule. But now with civil wars, barbarians, Persians who are formidable, the purpose of government changes to squeeze enough tax dollars to hire enough soldiers to keep the empire together. And the government grows incredibly. Well, we come to the 250s. Things have gone from bad to really bad. Two parts of the empire break off just for self-protection. There's a secessionist state in Syria, in the trading town of Palmyra. Now, this is actually a cool picture with a real screen of the ruins of Palmyra. That just for their own security, they wind up breaking off from Rome because they're not getting enough help. And the Persians are causing a lot of trouble. But these folks do really good. They actually chase the Persians out of Syria. Then parts of France and England leave the empire just because they're dealing with so many barbarians. They're not getting any help from Rome. But in France, they call it the Gallic Empire. They have their own emperor who doesn't march on Rome. They just want to have their own little piece of the action. They issue coins that are worth a heck of a lot of money. And they have a senate and all of that. It looks like pretty much 8265. Rome's on the ropes. It looks like it's just about over with all of this that they're dealing with. But within a few years, a number of highly military aggressive and competent generals who all come from the Balkans. The Yugoslavia at that time was called Illyria. These guys completely turned things around for 200 years. But in the process, the Roman emperorship completely changes. Rome becomes very despotic. Well, the guy who first turns it around is a fellow named Aurelian, and he's from the Balkans. He was a cavalry commander who became a general, who became emperor. This was a can-do kind of guy. In 5 years, he turns everything around when it looks like Rome is on the ropes. He was such a can-do guy that his nickname was Manu ad Ferrum, which literally means hand on hilt, hand on sword. Well, he whips the Goths twice, the Vandals, the Euthangi, the Sarmatians, the Carpi. He kicks them all out, and the Goths had an army 3 times his size. Oh, this guy's good. And he goes and he conquers the breakaway states in Syria and in France. But unfortunately, he had a very bad temper, and one of his secretaries got on his dark side and was very afraid of him, so he concocts a death list of certain generals that's false, and he shows them to him and says, by the way, Aurelian's got to get you. And they murder the guy who turned it around. But Aurelian was so successful that Rome now has a chance to make it. It is during this time that the persecutions of the Christians became the greatest, when Rome was in the biggest trouble. And the Christians were never persecuted for what they believed. They were persecuted because they would not sacrifice to the Roman emperors and the Roman gods. Christians were persecuted for political reasons. Because in a military autocracy, in despotism, If you once a year don't say, hey, this Roman thing is cool, I submit, you're in big trouble. Just like in the Soviet Union. Well, another guy from Dalmatia shows up who goes by the Greek name Diocles. But he's smart enough to know that he needs a Roman name, so he changes it to Diocletianus, who we call him Diocletian. This guy is another former cavalry commander, former general, becomes emperor. And he gets Rome on a good footing. Now, what he does is he actually attacks the succession problem, because he tries to have a system to where you don't have to kill the emperor if you don't like him. So the first thing he does is he gets one of his buddies, a fellow named Maximian, and he says, hey, why don't you be my co-emperor? And then each of them choose junior emperors. So you've got 2 senior and 2 junior emperors. These guys build in palaces in key positions around the empire so that whenever the barbarians or the Persians come, a high-ranking military authority who's an emperor to deal with the problem. It's great. Now, this is a picture that was stolen from Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade that's in Venice. And I don't know if you can see that, but you can see these 4 really dour, sour guys, and they got their arms around each other, and they got their hand on their sword hilts, and the message is, we're covering each other's back, and don't mess with us. Now, they were technically called by later historians the tetrarchy, which means the rule of 4. And instead of this system of the emperorship going to the son of who's ever not killed, we actually have a system based on merit. Well, the first thing that Diocletian does, well, it takes him about 10 years, is he tries to double the size of the Roman army. It's got to get bigger. Just like Nixon, he tries to do price controls. Just like Nixon, it doesn't work. The empire is divided for administration purposes. That's still one empire, but it's for administration cut in half. Now, Diocletian keeps complete control, and after 20 years, he's actually age 80 now, he does something no Roman emperor ever does. He abdicates, and he's still alive. And he issues real money. They make real money, and that helps the economy tremendously. However, there's a huge change in government style. Now, the time of Augustus of the 200 wonderful years, that was called the Principate, because he was called princeps, for citizen. This is called the dominate. Now, in Latin, dominus means lord or master, but it's what a slave calls his master. And the traditional Roman greeting, the adoratio, is replaced by something called the proskynesis. When you would come to see Diocletian, you would have to be either really wealthy or high in the government or high in somebody else's government. Common people never saw Diocletian. And when you greet him, you have to be lower than him. You might have to get on your belly. And if he likes you, you get to kiss the hem of his jeweled gown. He wore gold slippers. And the emperor is almost portrayed as a god-like figure who wields unbelievable control, but all Roman emperors wield unbelievable control. And this incredible autocracy is his way of trying to get a handle on Rome's many problems. Now, this is a map showing you the Roman Empire gets divided into 4 sections, and for 20 years it works absolutely great. But there's a real problem. It all is hinging on Diocletian and his authority. When he abdicates, civil war breaks out all over again. One of the things that Diocletian does, he's got to grow the government to squeeze more taxes out of the Roman Empire. And he's also got to have more control so that it is a civil war to kick him out. Now, in the time of Augustus, there was maybe 900 civil servants for 60 million people in the Roman Empire. How did they do it with so few civil servants? But by Diocletian time, it rises from 30 to 35,000 bureaucrats. The Romans go from 12 provinces to 101 administrative districts called a diocese. And these are run by a guy called a Wakarii, which, if you can actually see that, it's the word vicar. So the Catholic Church got its administration from the Roman Empire. But the Catholic Church was thoroughly Romanized and became part of the government. The amazing thing, AD 300, Rome has no political significance. It's too far from the action. The action is going to be in Milan, it's going to be in Nicomedia in Turkey, it's going to be close to the Danube or Rhine. Rome is not important. Also, there's a great change. The Roman senators, who are like, they would be the equivalent of somebody with a net worth of 500 million more, they don't get military commands anymore. Because if they get military commands, they have administrative experience. If they get military experience, they can kick out the emperor. So the guys who are worth about 100 million, they were called equites, they get the military commands. So this huge rise of government to get more control and this change of the nature of the government, the emperors, now that they have this giant bureaucracy, they don't get more control, they get less. Well, we come up to the guy who changed things probably as much as Augustus, but unfortunately for the worse. And that's Constantine, Saint Constantine, which you study his history, the last thing he is a saint. Now, he was called the 13th apostle. And the reason for that is he decriminalized Christianity. And there was probably 5% of the empire was Christians. And he still built pagan temples and he issued pagan coins. And he was even deified when he died by the Roman Senate. But he built a ton of churches. And he tried very hard to get the empire turned back around. But later on, the Romans paid for what he did. And he also took the clergy of the Catholic Church and made them government employees. We have state-sponsored religion. He gets control of the Western Empire, 312, 324, he runs the whole show. But he makes some mistakes. For the time, they work good, but the later emperors pay for them. One of the things is he brings hordes and hordes of barbarians into the empire. He brings in the nomadic Sarmatians, 300,000. This is not new. Roman generals and emperors had brought in barbarians before because if you could bring them in and get them to farm, because all the barbarians were farmers, except for the Sarmatians. Well, now they can pay taxes. Now they're not enemies of the empire, and hey, you can squeeze a little tax money out of them, and you can come back in a few years and say, we need young men for the army. But barbarians had never been brought into the empire on a massive scale. And with so many incredible amounts of barbarians, there was no way to assimilate them. Also, Constantine changes the army. He divides the army between what's called limitanii, which is like border guards, and the comitatenses, which is the mobile strike force. With the army, you've got these guys on the borders, and there's not enough of them to stop the barbarians. They're just there to kind of like intimidate the barbarians, and then the barbarians penetrate the frontier, and the strike force has got to deal with them. The main reason that Constantine did this was that if there's a civil war against him, he's got a mobile strike force all over the empire. But the later emperors could not make it work, and a number of the chroniclers spoke very bad about Constantine for doing that. Also, we see the rise of barbarian generals. Now, in the time of Galerius, let's just say AD 260, there's quite a number of high-ranking barbarian generals in the Roman army, because the Romans would take the promising aristocrats from the barbarians and put them through an officer candidate school. So these guys you think of as smelly, grubby barbarians with long hair and beards, these guys are not like that. They speak and read Latin and probably speak Greek. Constantine is surrounded by Germanic barbarians, mostly Franks. He promotes many of them. And most of his army is northern barbarians. I don't know if you can see these pictures, but these are two famous barbarian generals, Stilicho and Aetius. These guys gave Rome tremendous victories. So when we talk about barbarians, we have to think they're not all smelly, dirty barbarians. These guys speak Latin much better than me. Well, we're going to have to rush through this. The first major disaster in the Roman Empire where a Roman army was crushed by barbarians on Roman soil was at Adrianople. And this was by the Goths. But the moral of the story here is that Rome now is so weak, it takes them 6 years to deal with a marauding group of Goths going through the empire, pillaging and looting. But eventually they do because they're too big to fail. In 395, the unimaginable happens. Rome splits in half. It's just too darn big for one person to run. That's why when you had 4 emperors, that worked really good. So the Roman Emperor Theodosius dies, and his 2 sons, Arcadius and the worthless and stupid Honorius, they get the east, they get the west. There's 2 Roman empires. This is final, this is permanent. And the 2 Roman empires, they kind of help each other every now and then. They don't like each other. If they can profit from the loss of the other, they'll do it. We come to the late 4th century. It's an entirely different landscape. Armies are much smaller. Whenever the Romans get in a serious war or battle, they are scrounging mercenaries. They do not have the money to keep enough full-time soldiers. Instead of these large Hollywood-style battles, they deal with the barbarians with massacres and raids, because when the barbarians massacre and raid them, that's what they do. And we see a period in the western part of the empire, that would be Spain, Italy, France, England, where you have really weak emperors dominated by barbarian generals and courtiers. And the unimaginable happens in the early 400s. In a diplomatic treaty, the Romans have to give hostages. They have never given hostages. Rome has always been so powerful. If you do business with them and you're a barbarian, you give hostages. So Rome is getting weak now. Well, the turning point comes in AD 390. The Goths actually make their way back into the Romans' good graces because they need them as soldiers. And in the Battle of Frigidus in the Balkans, the Romans kind of used the Goths as cannon fodders. They assault a mountain pass, which is really hard. 10,000 Goths are slaughtered. Well, one of these aristocrats who went through the Roman officer training program was a guy named Alaric. Alaric, not happy with this. And he speaks Latin. He reads Latin. He's one heck of a general. But he decides that he's going to use his folks. He's going to use the empire for his benefit. And he acts as a Roman general, then he threatens Rome, then he pillages, then he acts like a Roman general. In AD 410, he sacks Rome. Now this is not your typical sack where, everybody's slaughtered. Churches, the Goths were Christians. They were a type of Christian that no longer exists, called Arians. But churches are okay and the nuns are left alone. Not a whole lot of murder, everything of value is stolen, but it's not slaughter. And the Roman slaves get in on the action too. But Alaric has put himself in a terrible position. Now that he's sacked Rome and the emperor's in Milan, because you can't assault Milan. Milan is surrounded by swamps. You can't lay siege. Now the emperor will not deal with him. But the fact that a barbarian general threatens the empire for his own benefit, it takes 2 generations. The barbarians realize they no longer need a Roman emperor to get what they want. And this turns the system completely upside down. Well, in AD 435, a Germanic group that came through France, came through Spain, and then winds up in North Africa. And North Africa was the juiciest Roman tax source there was. When the Romans lose that, they don't have money for military activities in other places that don't produce taxes. And this is pretty much the death knell of the Western Empire. But we have to remember that in this time, the Eastern Empire, which would be Greece, part of the Balkans, Palestine, Syria, they're doing just fine. They got plenty of money. They got plenty of soldiers. Well, the Huns show up, and the Huns played very heavily in the fall of Rome. Now, the Huns came from somewhere in Eurasia. We don't even know why they come. There's all kind of silly theories, but you get down to it, we don't know. We don't even know what their language was. The Romans had used the nomadic Huns, who were all horse archers, against the Germans, the Germanic peoples, very successfully. And the Huns were essentially, they ran a mafia-style extortion thing, where what they did is first they came to the Eastern Empire, they came to Greece, and the Romans actually bought them off. And then finally, they asked for so much money, the Romans said, go away. And they tried to assault Constantinople, but they couldn't. So then they came over to the Western Empire. This is a picture of Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun is actually the national hero of Hungary. And he's about as sociopathic and psychotic as a leader could ever be, because they slaughtered incredible numbers of barbarians and Romans just to be paid off to leave them alone. And their business model was pillage and extortion. This, you can't see, this shows you Attila went all over the place. Well, now with the Western Empire, in the Eastern Empire, Attila smashes a German general who's actually a Goth named Arnegisculus at the Battle of Utis, but the Huns suffer very heavy losses. So then he goes over to the Western Empire, and here he's a nice guy. He provides troops for the Romans to fight the barbarians, and the Romans use the Huns very well. In fact, they give him the honorary title Magister Militum, which is like master of the soldiers. Then one of the strangest things in world history happens, and I'm not making this up. The sister of the Roman emperor, the Emperor Honorius, a real idiot, he's got her betrothed to some near ancient Roman senator. She doesn't want to get married. So through a courier, she sends her engagement ring to Attila the Hun and says, please help me. I don't want to marry this jerk. Well, he takes that as a marriage proposal. And he believes that the entire Western Empire is the dowry. Oh, that isn't going to go good. But to give you an idea of how things have changed, how weak is the Western Empire, he is finally defeated. And he's defeated the Roman emperor, this Aetius that you saw a picture of. He's half barbarian. And most of the Roman army is barbarian. And there are contingents of the Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians who come and join along. And they fight under their own banners. And Attila is defeated. But Aetius does not, he could have crushed Attila, but he doesn't, because he's going to need him to balance out the other barbarians. And for that, he is killed. He is the second great barbarian emperor who doesn't wipe out barbarians when he can, because he's going to need them down the road. Who's killed? Well, finally, AD 476, Rome is given its death knell. That is the Western Empire. But really, since around the early 400s, as a political reality, Rome is dead. The idea of Rome is alive. Many people are hoping that the Romans will get it together. So what happens is that there's a Roman general named Orestes. And he is sent by the emperor named Julius Nepos, whose name means Julius the grandson. And he is sent to go deal with the barbarian Burgundians who are in France, who are pillaging and looting. And he has a barbarian army. The entire Roman army is barbarian. They're mercenaries. And he comes to the mercenaries and he says, I tell you what, let's go kill Julius Nepos, and you can make me emperor, and I'll give you land in Italy. And that's a deal they can't pass up, because they want land. They're farmers. So Julius Nepos is killed. And then the barbarians come up to Orestes and they say, it's time to pay. It's time to pay. And then he actually is stupid enough to run away, because he knows that the Roman landed aristocracy aren't going to go with that. But hey, he's the guy with the army. Then another barbarian educated general, Flavius Odoacer. The barbarians come to Odoacer. Well, actually in English it's Odovaker, but we really don't know how the barbarians pronounce their names. They come to Odovacer and they said, hey, Orestes stiffed us. We need land. We'll make you emperor. We'll make you king if you'll give us land. So Orestes is quietly put out of the way. Now Orestes had crowned his 14-year-old son emperor after he deposed Julius Nepos. And now the Roman emperor is so insignificant that when Odovaker comes up to Milan, where the emperor is staying, he doesn't even kill the emperor. He sends him off to Campania for a comfortable retirement, and he crowns himself king, not emperor, king. And Rome is now considered officially dead. Well, if you can read this, it says harebrained schemes for the fall of the empire. There's over 1,000 theories for the fall of Rome. And one way to think about it is so many negative things happened, eventually it just had to come to fruition. And when we look at the reasons for the fall of the Western Empire, while the Eastern Empire is alive, if we put these theories to both empires, they just don't make any sense. The one that I love to hear that people heard on the History Channel, and if they heard it on the History Channel, it has to be true, lead pipes. Well, there was lots of lead pipes in the Eastern Empire, and it did make them slow-witted and dim-witted because they lasted almost 1,000 years. Edward Gibbons, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1776, referred to Christianity as superstition. And he said that it made the Romans weak and they lost their martial ardor. But they were Christians in the Eastern Empire, and they ran the show for a long time. Many times I'm at the gym working out, and I always have a Roman history book with me because I read on a treadmill. And there's not a month that goes by where somebody says, well, you know, I was in seminary or I was in college. My professors told me how wicked and evil those Romans were, and that's why they fell. But when Rome fell, they fell to Christian barbarians. And the whole pagan business had been shot down officially for over 100 years. So this thing about massive immorality, that applies to the Republic, not to the Empire. Transformation. Oh, this is great. Because we have to remember, when the barbarians took over, they didn't shut down the schools. The tax man was busy. They wanted the taxes. And the schools still ran, the courts ran. So people say it's transformation. But transformation doesn't realize that a whole lot of people had to die for the barbarians to turn 12 Roman provinces to a whole bunch of barbarian kingdoms in the West. Now I have one here. The Marxists actually said that it was class war that destroyed the Roman Empire. And here's a quote. I don't know if you can read it. Well, communism only happens to be the greatest failure of the 20th century, and class warfare had nothing to do with the fall of the Republic or the fall of the Empire. Because the rich folks still controlled everything. Kind of like what they do now. Well, what are the reasonable reasons for the fall of the Empire? The damage from so many barbarian incursions, the Persians, civil wars. Rome just didn't have the money to keep a good army. As long as they had money, and long as they could keep the army going, they made a good showing and they beat barbarians. And also, as they lost little bits of territory, they lost the taxes that came from them. The Huns play a huge role in this because the fear of the Huns drove so many barbarians into the Roman Empire. The Goths had fought the Huns and been soundly defeated. The amazing thing is that finally the great psychotic, bloodlusting Attila the Hun dies. He gets like wife number 8 and he drinks himself to death and has a brain hemorrhage. Best thing that could have happened to Europe. And when he dies, the Hunnic Empire scatters to the wind. Now the Romans don't have the Huns as mercenaries, and they got to cut deals with the barbarians on a very unfavorable basis. The empire broke up because too many barbarians came inside, were brought inside, and then through war took more and more. The barbarians could also put incredible numbers of men in the field. The Roman couldn't match it. Now, they could never match the Romans in training, equipment, logistics, or just generalship, but they had so many guys that the Romans could stabilize them, but at many times they could not kick them out. And by AD 400, the majority of the troops of the Western Empire are barbarian. Rome operated as an incredible tax redistribution machine. The Goths figured out that they could get a piece of the action and use it to their benefit. Part of the seeds of the destruction of the Roman Empire came with its relationship with the Germans, because it could never really anticipate what those changes with the Germanic people were going to be. Edward Gibbons said that Rome fell because of its stupendous fabric, meaning that it was just so big no one person could rule it. But when it split in half, that wasn't a problem. Lastly, I have a quote from one of my favorite historians, Peter Heather. He says, "By virtue of its unbounded aggression, Roman imperialism was ultimately responsible for its own destruction." So I will open the floor to questions. Yes.
Wait for the microphone.
Hold it.
Oh, you get a microphone.
Let me get the microphone on and walk over. I'll pass it now. We're recording the program. Recording the program. And so if you don't put your question in the microphone, it's lost. And the answer doesn't mean it. Pass it now. Last table. Window table.
I was going to ask about the older Roman Empire during like the Middle Ages. Are they considered to be Rome? You said Rome fell, but did they continue in that form?
They weren't Roman.
They were Roman.
They weren't Roman at all. And they certainly were not holy.
Well, what?
They were not holy. And their empire was pretty dinky.
They just called themselves Roman because they were
more marketing. Kind of like the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea? Yeah, sure. Yes, sir.
You indicated at the very beginning that what we read in the book, Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, that what the book said basically was incorrect. But let me finish my statement. And when you get in, one of the things that I understood from that book was the German barracks was they brought them into Rome, and they were able to kind of hurt them within. And based on what you've said, that was a major problem with Rome, plus the other civil wars and other things that they had. But the barbaric was probably, when they were able to infiltrate the Roman Empire, then they were able to cause it to fall, because their interests were different from the real Romans. And I see some similarity between what you indicated and what I read in the book.
Yeah, there's always similarities. Gibbons is such a great work. It's like there's a fantastic one-liner on every page. I wish I could remember them all. But Gibbons had three conclusions that really don't hold water. One of which is that Christianity weakened Rome. Another one is that Rome was just too big, and it fell because it was so big. Those conclusions of his, you don't find much modern scholarship to agree with that. But we certainly have a lot of illegals in our border. However, we're not bringing them in like the Romans did. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes.
Hello. You've covered a small amount of material here, so I'll have to shrink my questions accordingly to fit them in.
Email me.
Yes, but a couple of things have occurred in looking for comparisons between this sprawling history of Rome that you compressed into such a short time and things that are going on right now. And you essentially mentioned the amount of money that the emperors had to scrape up to support their armies once the armies got out of control and so on. And I couldn't help but draw a parallel between the immense worldwide spread of American military power and the dark budget that supports it. And I wondered if you had any, I'm thinking here of both the military and the military intelligence apparatus. I wondered if you had any comment whatsoever on the parallel there. It's a very vague parallel because it covers so much.
The Romans did have military intelligence, and they did have their own NSA. They were called the frumentarii. But our military-industrial complex is for profit, and the Romans stopped expanding after the 2nd century, and their massive military expenditures were just to keep the empire intact. That would be the big difference between them and us. I hope that answers your question.
Hello.
Certainly somebody has to have a serious disagreement with me.
Pretty close like this. Okay. Well, first, thank you for speaking to us tonight about something you spent so much time studying and learning about. I appreciate it. My question is about thinking of the common people. During all of these transitions, the influx of Germanic and barbarian peoples into Roman territory and Roman legions, I'm wondering, the common farmer, Roman farmer or barbarian farmer, and in what ways, if any, were they aware of these major shifts in power and major shifts in population? Because as you said, a lot of what was occurring is on a very high level because of money, very wealthy people, people with a lot of power. And so I'm wondering, people who didn't have a lot of money and weren't in positions of power, were they aware of these transitions, which took place over many, many years, I know, but...
The people at the bottom don't leave a whole lot of historical records. Most Roman history is actually written by the super rich. And there is a huge reevaluation of the source material, because when the entire history is mostly written by super rich white guys at the top, how balanced is that? With Constantine, the monetary debasement went on. Now, he issued gold coins that were 100%, but the common people would never have gold coins. And many of the people at the bottom were crushed by Constantine's policies. It also got to the point with Diocletian. He made whatever your father did, that's what you would do. And the farmers, it was the beginning of serfdom, because if you were a farmer, you couldn't leave. Your kids could not leave, no matter how much you liked or hated it. If your father was a soldier, you would be a soldier. Taxes got really high. For the ancient world, for farmers, it actually got up to like 30%. So whether they knew about all that, but many of the farmers and the small people up around the frontiers, with hordes of barbarians coming in, they're there for loot. They're there for pillaging. Now, sometimes they stick around. Many times when the barbarians came in, the Romans had to give them land. And a lot of the land came from the wealthy, but it also came from the small people who were farmers. So they paid a heavy price for the emperors of Rome. Heavy price. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Poverty. And for many people, it's like if you were born a farmer, you'll die a farmer. You can't leave. If you leave, they will catch you. And when they catch you, it's not good. It became like it.
Sorry. So I had just wondering if the entry comparison to the European Union was a fair comparison, considering that the two have somewhat dissimilar goals, or if the comparison was made more to establish the setting that
establish the setting, because I've read some of the Euro leaders say, gosh, we just like to be as big and as powerful as Rome, but we're not. That's what I mean. Because, you know, none of those countries are oppressive autocracies. Now. Oh.
I have a question about Northern Africa, because as you said, it's the economic breadbasket of the Roman Empire. And was there there seems to have been a turning point in which, I'm wondering if there was a problem with like the elites, that the Romans were not able to co-opt like the elites within Northern Africa at some point. I mean, did the elites of Northern Africa see themselves as, I mean, they probably saw themselves as Romans?
That was really never a problem. One of the amazing things, why did the Romans run the show so long, is their system co-opted like the top 2% all over the empire. Right. And they were better off under Roman control than they were under their former whoever ran the show. So that was not the problem with North Africa. The problem with North Africa was when the Vandals essentially stole it. And the tax dollars stopped flowing in, and the army immediately got smaller.
Okay, thank you.
The Romans could only do what they did for so long because, you know, if you were from the landed gentry and you were pretty wealthy, it didn't matter whether you were Carthaginian, whether you were Spanish, you could be Moorish. There was an emperor, Philip the Arab. And the last couple of hundred years, most of the emperors came from Yugoslavia. There's a lot of empires, you don't see anything like that. Next question.
Okay, right here, Lloyd, behind you. You mentioned about the barbarians that were just being brought in by great numbers. Was the very reason for bringing them in to collect more taxes?
Well, there was a number of reasons, one of which is the Romans are trying to take enemies and defang them. And they figured that if they gave them land and they became farmers, which most of the barbarians were farmers, that now they won't have to fight them, and they're going to have a pool of young men they desperately need for the army, and they'll pay taxes. But sometimes they were brought in as hostages, like, okay, you're going to be here, and if you act bad, we're just going to kill you. They didn't have any problem with killing the barbarians.
All right. You mentioned a number of times about their recurring civil wars. Any way of knowing what on earth was causing the civil wars? You said that weakened them a whole lot through the centuries.
The problems with the civil wars, you had great emperors, you had bad emperors. And when the Romans had bad emperors, they were really bad. But from about 200 AD on, the emperor's job is military success. And if you have many of the civil wars, You have an emperor who, like Alexander Severus, he tried to buy the Alemannia. He was killed. He was murdered. If an emperor lost a number of battles, even if it wasn't his fault, that was it. Or if an emperor's power base became insecure, that was all it would take. But you see this in many other empires as well, like the Persian Empire, the Parthian Empire. Any kind of military trouble, the king, the emperor's gone. That's it.
Well, the Civil War would be defined as fighting among themselves with different factions and groups. Can you explain a little bit more what factions were fighting each other, the north, the south, or?
Competing army groups, competing armies, Roman armies.
Competing Roman armies, okay. Very good. Who would you say was the first emperor? Is there a historical?
Augustus.
He was definitely the first emperor.
He was the first. Julius Caesar acted like an emperor, but he wouldn't call himself. And many of the Romans were horrified that he would make himself emperor, and just for that alone, he was assassinated. Then along comes Octavianus, who becomes Augustus. And he's got the marketing very few politicians have the genius to come up with.
Okay, one last question. A piece of Rome, the Pax Romana, went from about when to when?
It went from 31 AD to 235. 31 BC to 235 AD.
35 BC.
Okay, guys, next question. Who has one? I see you.
Henry George, in his book Progress and Poverty, posits that many nations, when they start out, everybody is kind of an independent economic individual. And that as time goes on, just like we have now, there's growing wealth inequality. And he said that in Rome and Greece, that when they started out, everybody had their couple acres and they were an independent, proud person. But by the end, all the land had gone to the patricians. And so the average person didn't have much to fight for, plus all the psychological problems that come with, economic insecurity. How do you feel about that?
I don't think that that's a very fair analogy of the ancient world. We have to understand that whether it's Greece or Rome or Egypt or Persia, the whole system is based on massive inequality. Now, yeah, Rome was built by citizen soldier farmers, by militiamen. But from the very beginning, Rome was run by the elites. It was designed for, pampered to elites. It was not an accident. And when it became an empire, it became 10 times worse. So there was rampant inequality from day one, but it became worse over time. So you could say that, but for as much as you could say that, I would disagree with it. Because it's not really their system. Their system was totally geared for inequality. The Romans had two sets of law, one for the real rich and one for us. And they never apologized. That's the way things were, and to them, the way things should be. There's the famous Roman writer, Pliny the Younger. He said that there is nothing more equal than equality, because if everybody's equal, you will debase the people of substance, the wealthy people, the government people, the generals. You will debase them if everybody's equal. So I would tend to say no more than yes. Yes, sir.
The term Holy Roman Empire, how did that come about, and when supposedly was the supposed Holy Roman Empire?
Well, we're getting into, I believe, past the Dark Ages. I'm more of a classical guy, but the Holy Roman Empire was in like Austria and around in that area. Yugoslavia, Hungary. But they're not really Roman. They're not Italian. It's just more marketing.
How much did the supposedly Holy Roman Catholic Church and the Pope have to do with that?
That I don't know. Couldn't tell you.
Okay, guys, we've gone through questions. We've hit 8 o'clock. I want to leave, and thank you, first time comers, for coming tonight. Come again. Enjoy your presence. We need to go on to the last section of our program tonight. And if we do like Lloyd found in our last time, we may not have a whole lot of individual comments to offer on a subject that he knows so much more about than most of us do. But we will open the floor for that. To make your comments, come up to the podium. We'll let Lloyd sit down for a bit, and then we'll give an opportunity at the end to give us some closing remarks and make some response to the things that have been said. So you can take 3, 4, 5 minutes and give us some comments that you might want to offer to the group. Whether you might want to agree with something or disagree with something or flesh it out in some area that you know something about. Let's open it up and do that. Lloyd, take a break.
Okay.
Second time it happened. Nobody argues with it. It's great. They're very select.
Well, you know, the teacher doesn't have any ability to punish the class for not participating. There's no detention hall at the college complexes. So if nobody has any real comments to offer to that. Are you willing to make a comment or two? Come on up. You always have good comments to make. You have a good academic presentation skills, so bring it on, man. Give us a dose. Give us a little. Oh, yeah, that reminds me. I went around and passed the offering plate, at the beginning of the meeting. There may have been a half dozen of you who came in later. A couple of people had $20 bills. I broke several of those and ran out of change. Charles caught me and paid his up after he got change. So if you haven't put your $3 in for the evening, please do that. That helps us buy the speakers' meals and do all the printing and the things that Tom does to administer it. So catch me and drop that little bit on me if you would, please. And come on in.
Well, I would like to thank you for your explanation of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. I just read that one book. I didn't shout it, but I did. Whenever I read something, I agree and disagree, and with some of the things in there. But when the fact that the nomadic Germans came in and we kind of blended them in with society, the book said they was kind of free with citizenship, and they brought in all these nomadic people with citizenship, and they didn't have the same respect for Romans that Romans did, and that caused them to slip. And the fact that they had such a huge empire, but when they split the empire, what I read was Constantine was the one that did that divided between Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and it was Constantine that made Christianity the dominant religion in Rome. And I had an experience a few years ago in 2007. My wife and I went on an Eastern Mediterranean cruise, and I taught world history for a couple of years in the beginning of my career. And we talked about all these places, and I'd never been there. But we flew into Istanbul, Turkey, and that was the former Constantine, but I understand at the time I was studying history was not located on two continents, Europe and Asia. And so that was interesting, and we went through Greece and all the other places. But I do see some similarity in some of the things that were going on in Rome's and some of the things that's going on here. When I look at our political system here, the things that boggles my mind is so many people vote for candidates whose policy will hurt them. And I can't understand that. If I got to hurt myself to hurt someone else, then nobody's going to be hurt. And we get so caught up in ideology, and like you said, the poor people, the working people, they didn't understand, and most people in the United States who are struggling don't understand. And they believe what sounds good. They don't read, and they really don't think. And that seemed to be a big part of Rome's, the farmers, and things was hurting them, but they really didn't know what was hurting them. And I guess that's why as a Christianity say you're supposed to be forgiven, you're supposed to turn the other cheek. That may have had a great deal of influence because mostly poor people adhere to Christian doctrines more than other people do. We all have our beliefs, but we are not governed by that. So I'm not really disagreeing with you because you got a much better grip on it than I have, and you read more than I've read. I just read that one book in the book that I taught from. So that if it was wrong, and I suspected it was written by the elite. A lot of the writing in the United States is written by elites. And it doesn't relate to the average person. We argue now about the disparity of the inequality in income in America is because we have a large group of people who are untrained in a work world that's changing. And any job, if they get a job, it's going to be a low-paying job. And even though 70% of our economy is driven by consumption, a large block of people can't buy nothing because they don't have the money. And I've kind of looked at things in my life, things people get, beans and basic food that people could live on, used to be cheap, it's high now. So I think it's some similarities between what was going on in Rome, and we have a class system in America. We don't put a great deal of importance on, articulate a great deal. We put more on race and peripheral issues to divide and polarize people rather than we got a class system, we don't like poor people. Former Governor Mitt Romney, I think he came close to it when he said 47% of the people he didn't care much about. And that was that group of people that, that was kind of like the Roman farmers and things like that. And history was a caste system. And we are in a country, we don't have that. I don't think we're going to go down the way the Romans did. It may have some similarities. If we go down, it's because we cannot transcend this thing of race and gender. I think that's going to be our downfall. We can't solve that problem. And, we go to Iraq and want to solve those problems between the Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites, and that goes way, way back. And we can't solve a problem here. And the greatest problem historically is between African Americans and whites. And we don't know anything about Africa. I went to Africa the first time in 2007. Dr. Alexander took excursion to Cairo. And so I don't know anything about Africa. All I know is here, the language and the culture. But if we can't bridge that gap, and that's another thing about it, we all basically been programmed the same way. But we can't overcome that. And I guess I thought we would overcome it in the 60s and 70s, and I didn't really train my children how to deal with it. And they're going to be kind of like the farmers in Rome's. They know it's hurting, but they don't know why. And that's dangerous. Thank you.
One of you handed me a $5 bill a minute ago, and I wasn't really looking. Was that you? There's your $2 back. I looked at that. Yeah, that would be an awful surtax. I won't put that on there. That made me feel guilty. I just didn't look down, to see what you gave me. I'm sorry about that. All right, does anybody else have a comment to offer? Well, I don't have any great words of wisdom. I really enjoyed our meeting tonight. You guys asked some very good questions. I appreciate your participation. Lloyd, come up and give us some closing comments, and we'll shut it off and let them bust the tables and get out of here with a smile. Bill, just one other thing I will say to you, and a lot of people have left, but so mostly just our core folks are here, but please do be kind to the servers. They've taken good care of us. One waitress and 2 helpers taking on this gang at one time, and they're so friendly and so nice to us. They take such good care of us. We want to be sure that we take good care of them. They don't charge us a fee for coming in the room. We really appreciate that. Can't get that everywhere, so we want to be sure we honor them and be sure we reward them in how we tip the table. So don't forget.
Constantine died AD 324, but it was Theodosius I. He died in AD 395, and his 2 sons, Arcadia and Honorius, they divided the empire. And let me just conclude that with the fall of the Western Empire, when the Eastern Empire lasted almost another 1,000 years, the barbarians had a whole lot to do with it. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. Meeting's adjourned. Those of you who'd like some coffee and maybe a treat, adjourn with us here in a few minutes down to Castellanda to the Starbucks. Come out next Saturday. We'll be here with bells on and ringing. See you next Saturday night. Good night.
This is William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like us, or follow us, and get notices of all our videos. We love it even when you call. So when visiting the Barbarians restaurant, tell them you want your reservation to the next College of Complex class.